Welcome to this special edition of Full Prefrontal, the Big Picture series. Coupled with our extensive library of conversations with leaders in the fields of neuroscience and cognitive, educational, and social psychology, in this special series, Sucheta plans to dive deeper into the science of executive function, including managing oneself and one's cognitive resources in order to achieve goals. Throughout the Big Picture series, we'll explore the difference between knowing and doing. She will share real-life examples and day-to-day tips for practicing intentional strategies to help you, your family, your team members, or your students build competencies in executive function to lead to stronger, more resilient relationships, sustainable communities, and fulfilling lives together. And now here is our host, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome to the podcast, Todd. How are you this morning?
I'm doing just great. As we record this, we're day 35 of the quarantine, but I'm really looking forward to this special edition, Big Picture, because wow, what a timely subject, talking about resilient families.
Oh, yes. I don't know about you, but I feel we are all in each other's faces, and so close proximity is, as they say, love grows fonder, I guess, only through distance. So this is just opposite. And I hate to admit it, I guess, but let's help our listeners and viewers now that we are going to give this video thing a try as well, to talk about this topic of resilience, bouncing back, coping, adjusting, tweaking. So to start with, I was thinking about this concept of striving. Striving is such a human response to life that we've been gifted. It reminds me, I had a chance to go to Amsterdam and they had just launched Van Gogh Museum, and they have the diaries and particularly a whole load of pages and pages and letters that Van Gogh wrote to his brother. And in one particular letter, he writes that if I cease searching, then woe is me. I'm lost. That is how I look at it. Keep going, come what may. And I think this just beautifully sums up this human experience of striving. But of course, this kind of striving where you're searching, like the Van Gogh talks about, is likely to guarantee one thing, that one thing is encountering unsurmountable challenge. And if you do nothing, yes, you can be assured to be safe and sound. But if you want to continue the striving, then you're going to encounter challenges. So the question now is, what kind of challenge is healthy? What kind of challenge actually propels us towards change and help benefits and helps us become better people, versus what kind of challenge can be paralyzing? So we want to today talk about going beyond coping. So ordinary everyday obstacles and roadblocks don't send us in a tizzy, but ongoing adversities and even major calamities do. As you know, what we are facing right now is this COVID-19 lockdown, shutdown, and not just staying at home, but eventually, I don't think collective human psyche has experienced this kind of uncertainty at the global level. Even if, let's say, we had 2008 financial meltdown, it was very America specific. Or when we heard tsunami, it was very Japan specific. We kind of knew people there, or we had to use our imagination what that might feel like, but we didn't globally share the same fear that I don't even know who is going to live through this. Do I have the immunity? Or am I a carrier? What's going to happen to old people like my parents? So these severe and unsurmountable challenges call upon a very special set of skills that go beyond simply coping. And that's what we're going to talk about, Todd.
Well, this idea of resiliency, it's something we've talked about frequently on this show. And boy, it is timely because this is the perfect time to strengthen our resiliency and build these set of skills. Hearing you go through your opening comments there, a number of headlines that I've been seeing have come to mind. The Idaho farm it's giving away millions of potatoes because of the virus is obviously less in demand. The small...
whether people need it or not, they have potatoes to give.
Yeah, no, I get it. Then there's that county in Louisiana or parish that has the highest death rate per capita in the country. There's that Catholic diocese that's reopening for mass despite these shelter-in-place orders from the government. Protests beginning to pop up all over the country, not far from you here in Michigan, where people are protesting these stay-at-home restrictions. I've seen discussions of teenagers may never be the same, and that's intriguing and scary at the same time. Then you have some good stories too. Those tornadoes that hit the South, the woman who saw that piano in the rubble of a destroyed church. and she
I
started
read
to play
that.
it to make people feel better. I mean, boy, conflicting emotions. I agree with you. I love the idea that this is something that we're all going through and it feels different. And I don't know how to say it, but it almost feels comforting to me to know that everyone's going through this. Then my final thought as we kick this thing off is, yeah, there's some terrible things happening, some unimaginable amount of loss of life from this. But I also feel like this is a chance, there's opportunity here.
Yes. And, simply as you were listing these headlines, my mind began to wander and my thoughts were scattered in million little directions. As humans, we are naturally curious and have this rubbernecking tendency. We want to know what's happening in other people's lives. How are they doing it? And then immediate thought comes to the mind is, how is my life similar or different than what I'm hearing? So if I hear a farmer in Idaho, I'm not a farmer and I do eat potatoes, but I've never lived in Idaho. My mind is thinking, man, how is that farmer going to support? How is going to transport? Who's going to bring these potatoes into different states?
Yeah.
As we are thinking about this tornado, I'm in the South, and yes, we had tornado warning last weekend for 3 consecutive days, and that's something doesn't happen. So what's so unique about this is we are interested in lives of others. We compare situations. One can become curious, one can become surprised, one can even become depressed, worried, and overwhelmed. But at the end of this interesting thing, you can turn the news off and you can stop yourself from the barrage of bad news mixed with good news here and there. But ultimately, having to hear news of setback can be overwhelming. But what's so unique about this COVID-19 situation is the news never ends. We still don't know what the outcome is. We still don't know where we stand in terms of our prior life. Is this going to stay the same? Are we going to stay even in the same income bracket? Are you going to have a job? Would your children be able to, how are they going to transition in the summer when they actually feels like it's summer already? So it's all exhaustion. And I'm a full grown adult, so are you. We are feeling overwhelmed, scattered, unproductive. So I'm just interested how are kids going to handle all this?
Yeah, well, my wife, when thinking about this whole thing and this pandemic, she's not afraid of catching it. She's not even really afraid of dying from it, but she is afraid of what's the world going to be like when we go back out into it. So that's the fear for her is how big a change are we going to see? Because we're never going to go back to the way things were before. But this COVID-19 has changed everything. I mean, we're not going out. We're not being social, which is a desperate human need. We're cooped up in places that we're not really used to doing that. We're spending inordinate amount of time with family that we're not used to doing, and that has repercussions. This is tough on a lot of people.
Yeah, and these are extraordinary times. So my question is, how do a group of people together handle challenging and extraordinary times? And what will help us to come to the other side safe, sane, and even skilled? And that's why I want to tie this idea of not just individual resilience, but family units resilience and developing skills during these extraordinary times, and provide people with some ideas as to how to think about the health of the family unit, interdependence of all members with each other, the strains and pre-existing holes that may have existed before but may get exaggerated or worsened because of pandemic. And is there a better way to cope? So that's what we're going to get into.
Good. Well, I hope you can help me cope because I haven't been able to see my mother in almost a month and a half now. And for those listening who don't know, my mother, late stage Alzheimer's, and she's in a community where she's on obvious lockdown, which is the right thing for them to do. But it's just surreal, Sucheta, for me not to be able to see her. Now, we FaceTime with her a couple times a week, but it's just a different kind of an experience. And she's doing well and we feel good about it. But it's been a real difficult adjustment for us to figure out how to be a part of her life.
There's a story I recently heard on NPR that this family was unable to see their mother who lives in a nursing home and also has Alzheimer's. So the two sisters went to the yard and peeked through the window and said hello to the mom just so that they felt some sort of connection in the same space. And as you said, I just cannot even imagine what you must be going through not having seen her, and particularly knowing that she needs assistance and the struggle she has with memory. So I'm praying for all of us, and particularly you getting to see your mom sooner.
Yeah, good. Thank you. We need it.
So let's start with the idea of family resilience, defining resilience. And there's a famous researcher whose work I'm going to quote today. Her name is Froma Walsh. And she defines that it's the ability to withstand and rebound from disruptive challenges, strengthened and more resourceful. So it's not just bouncing back. That's what we're going to talk about. There was a great presentation I recently attended with Jonathan Haidt, and he was also talking about, so take an example of a glass. For a cup of water, you use a glass, and then if the glass slips from your fingers, it shatters. So resilience is not shattering, but a glass does shatter. So sometimes people think about resilience as a styrofoam cup. So if the styrofoam cup falls to the ground, it doesn't crack. Now, one interesting thing about this definition, though, is in the previous situation or example of a glass cup, it shatters, so it's all messed up. You never recover. And styrofoam implies that you recover exactly the same. So resilience is neither. And particularly family resilience is something even more or bigger than that. A styrofoam cup doesn't undergo change. It doesn't become pink after being dropped to the floor. It stays exactly the same. And that's not what happens to us because we are dynamic beings and we change because of our interactions with life. So the other thing to think about the concept of resilience is it's an American myth, so to speak. A lot of researchers talk about this, that just bounce back. And just bouncing back is something that is within a person as a character, almost a gift. And some people are designed to bounce back and some people don't. But the story is a lot larger. That's why I thought we'll talk a little bit more about the family as a unit, because we are human beings who need people and we are social creatures. We really cannot talk about resilience. And always, I've been to a lot of talks and I've heard people talk a lot about this, that we want our children to be resilient. But we can't talk about children without talking about their parents, without talking about the family dynamics, without talking about the community in which they operate, because it's a resilient unit. I don't know if you've seen this painting, Todd. There's a very famous American painter. His name is Andrew Wyeth. And I had a chance to see his painting called Christina's World, which is a beautiful landscape. And in the distance, there's a gray colored house, or maybe two, but it's almost a prairie. And in the forefront of the picture, there's a young woman, maybe a teenager, sitting on the ground. And you certainly can see she cannot walk and she's trying to drag herself towards the house. It's a beautiful and moving piece because you can see the effort in that girl. So when I think about resilience, it's that effort of this girl. And the backstory, by the way, is that this painting is actually described as something, MoMA website says that Wyatt's neighbor, Anna Christina Olsen, inspired the composition, which is one of 4 paintings by Wyatt in which she appears. As a young girl, Olsen developed a degenerative muscle condition, probably polio, that left her unable to walk. She refused to use a wheelchair, preferring to crawl as depicted in this picture, using her arms to drag her lower body along. The challenge to me, Wyatt explained, was to do justice to her extraordinary conquest of a life which most people would consider hopeless. And what's so nice about this, the critics say that this is more describing the psychological landscape of Christina as a young woman with polio who cannot walk, but doesn't want the support of a wheelchair, and she wants to support herself. So resilience is often described as this process of individuals' effort to withstand and rise above adversities. But we want to talk more about behind the scenes of that, beyond the individual.
Well, when I was hearing you describe this painting, I'm certainly familiar with Andrew Wyeth, but I had not seen this specific painting. But hearing you talk about what it represents, I almost went back to my Stoic philosophy where, it's not what actually happens to you, it's how you respond to what happens to you. And am I kind of on the right path when I think of resiliency being the ability to do that?
You nailed it. I think it's what you do with what you got. The simple colloquialism, life gives you lemons and you make lemonade.
Right. Yep.
It's a good way to think about resilience. It's interesting, though, as I was mentioning, there are cultural connotations. Every culture has some kind of reference to resilience. I'll give you a Confucius's quote. It says, "The green reed which bends in the wind is stronger than the mighty oak which breaks in the storm." So that's often used as a visual image of a mighty oak cracking under pressure, but it's the bending and swaying and still standing, coming to form at the end is how resilience works. Another interesting concept that I thought worth mentioning was in Korean culture, there's a concept of han, which is suffering but not without hope. So there's a wonderful idea that suffering is inevitable, suffering is human condition, and suffering, just like happiness, is impermanent. That means there is the other side of suffering. And keeping yourself aware of that is resilience, honestly.
That's where I was going earlier when I said I feel like there's an opportunity as we go through this pandemic. I feel like there's two groups of people. There are those that are just all doom and gloom and the world's never going to be the same. And then there are those that say there's an opportunity here to learn and grow. Is that kind of what you mean by that?
Yeah. And so now let's talk about the family. So just like a person, a family also has its own personality. You have a funny family, a family that's an adventure family of jokesters, family that's very serious. And so each family also as a unit has this capacity to withstand and rebound from disruptive life challenges by designing or strategies that they become more resourceful. So Robert Frost says a home, a place where when you go there, they have to let you in. And this is such an interesting thing because you don't belong to a family if the family doesn't let you belong. And that can be anti-resiliency, of course, And John Powell also has a quote which says, our lives are shaped by those who love us and by those who refuse to love us. And if you know anything about human psychology, we actually find it disturbing or we obsess about those who reject us. Actually, Freud has said that you marry your most difficult parent, apparently. I'm not sure if I know that to be true or if that's even Freud's quote, but I find that concept very interesting because if the family unit doesn't have its own style of resolving and coping and discussing and managing, then it can create challenge. But one thing I want to just mention, Todd, that American families don't get enough credit for being resilient because often the news is consumed by this child that was neglected or kept in a cage, or you find a baby left on the steps. But those are sensational news pieces that always show failures on human beings' part, but it doesn't celebrate families and their capacity to bounce back. So we want to do that as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the downside of listening to the news is it's all negative. There's a lot of amazing things happening, not just with businesses innovating to create product. I'm talking about families doing some interesting things behind those four walls as they're being resilient going through this.
Yeah. And, before COVID, I used to use the term resilience, and the adversity I used to describe was just simply a child being diagnosed with a disability and having lifelong chronic condition to deal with. But research shows that there are kind of 4 or more factors that need to persist in a person's life to then put your resiliency to test. For example, poverty, some mother's education apparently seems to be a very critical element. The family members or having with drug or alcohol problems and some type of chronic condition in the house. So if 4 or more conditions exist, then there is incredible stress that family can endure. But let me list some of the stressors that families can experience over a lifespan. Traumatic event. If you remember the movie, The Ordinary People, remember that? And in that, I guess the older brother, Buck, dies in a boating accident, but the younger brother, Timothy Hutton's character, blames himself and then goes through his own angst and attempts to commit suicide, goes to the psychiatric hospital, returns, but the mom is extremely angry and cold, which is Mary Tyler Moore, I think. But that is a beautiful movie that captures the traumatic event and its impact on the family dynamics and coping. Disruptive transitions. I worked with a family that got placed in Japan, and then father left and the children had to follow, but they were 3 children starting school, or by the time they landed there, it was mid-year, and making friends and finding your footing, all that can be a huge challenge. The next is persistent multi-stress conditions. So COVID-19 is a perfect example of persistent multi-stress conditions. Like I had, my mom lives with us, so she having just being old age, we want to be careful, but she developing some crisis that we had to take her to the ER. I had one son return from Tanzania and had to go into quarantine because he developed some symptoms. We weren't sure if they were COVID symptoms or not. And then having to shut down businesses, my husband and I trying to. So all the stresses came from multiple directions. And one of the things I noticed for me was my first thing to go is communication with friends and family. I go on a silent mode and people are like worried about me, but I have no strength to keep telling them that everything is okay. And this silence just often can be misinterpreted as I'm not interested or cold. But that's just something that I find is my typical pattern, I guess. And then at-risk youth, vulnerable families where there's living in poverty or living in very uncertain conditions and stressful life context. So there are so many things that can interfere or pose problems. And families become resilient over time, though. This is a very, very important thing that you can only after 2 years post-event can discuss. Oh boy, thank God we are here to talk about it. I remember you, after your dad passing away, having to shut down your operations in Florida and situating or deciding whether to bring your mom here. That was a major change. You had to decide it on a dime. And here you are to live and talk about it and feel kind of you're back to even keel, emotional even keel. So sometimes challenges that family face and family's approach to challenging situations determines how it will turn out for both of them, the individual members and the family as a unit. While adversities are disruptive, the how of the family management is really the key. And are they focused on developing coping strategies, or are they just so drowning in the stress of it all that they're not thinking, they're just reacting? And that can be a huge problem.
Well, as I have long thought about resiliency, to me, it's always been framed from an individual context, right? I was reading a biography of Benjamin Franklin, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of an idea. It's always been about resilient individuals, not resilient families. This is a new way for me to be thinking about that. So this has been an intriguing, eye-opening way to kind of understand this concept. If it's a resilient families, is it just made up a bunch of resilient people?
That's so interesting. I also am I'm a big fan of Benjamin Franklin, and I've quoted his work in many, many podcasts. I find that this is a very much American psychology, which has kind of seeped into individual nerve, I guess, or it's in our veins to think that you put the effort, you stand tall, you bring yourself back, you bring your functioning back. So the burden or the onus is perceived to be on the individual, but it's far from the truth. Last few decades of research in family resilience, the researchers are recommending us to think about the group interdependence. That means we need people and we must depend on people, and we do depend on people, whether those people are countable or not, or whether we are allowed to count on them or not. We are depending. And those, in fact, who find the right kind of people do a better job. And those who don't have some outlet, or another concept which I love is the charismatic adult. Children who had a charismatic adult during hardship tended to do better. So the relational aspect of resilience, actually finding mutual support and interdependence between the couples, for example, or co-partners, co-parents, siblings even, if particularly it's a large family and the older sibling apparently becomes the surrogate mother or father. And then caregiving team, like we know, I've worked with nursing homes and with brain injury rehab, where the caregiving teams becomes a large family unit supporting the families as well as the individual who's going through the trauma, and the kinship network. And one pseudo kinship network that we have now in our lives is the social media. So we have to be really careful about perceiving that to be true or not true social support network.
Well, I can vouch for the caregivers almost becoming part of the family. Those that are currently caring for my mother, who I'm spending a lot of time with on FaceTime, they almost feel like family. So I kind of get that. When it comes to crisis, is there a typical pattern as to how families respond to crises? And should we be looking for some sort of a theme when we think about family resilience?
Such a good question. Family Resiliency Network states that family resiliency is the family's ability to cultivate strengths to positively meet the challenges of life. What I love there is cultivating strength. And cultivating strength is actually skill-based development of family units' personality, as I was saying, or determining your collective characteristics that can help. So again, quoting Dr. Froma Walsh and her work, she has identified 9 processes that seem to somehow have incredible indicators of a family's capacity to cope effectively. And they can be categorized into 3 large buckets. One is beliefs, second is organization, and third is communication. So for example, talking about beliefs, this means what's the family's ethos? What is the cultural norm? So for me, for example, I always raise my children, my husband and I, we call ourselves Indian family. We have a multi-generational living as a part of the norm. We believe in, or like there's a saying I grew up being taught, which was called one sesame seed must be shared amongst seven. So this idea that the resources are not to be hogged by one person, everybody gets equal, but however small it is, it must be shared. It's so cute. I'll give you another quick example. This is not an example of resilience, but just as something, a characteristics of my family, I guess. So during COVID, as people were stacking toilet paper and water bottles or water, we never did that. We just said, no, if we run out of toilet paper, we'll go for Indian alternatives, as we call them. But we don't, typically I love to cook, so I don't have a lot of things stored in my freezer. So I kind of was a little worried that maybe this is just real and we should store some food. So I sent my husband to get some pizzas, cauliflower pizza. And so he goes to the store and he finds there are 4 cauliflower pizzas left in the freezer section. So he calls me and says, how many do you need? I said, I don't know, but why don't you get all 4 of them? He says, do you really need them? I said, no, maybe get 2 of them. He says, do you really need them? I said, fine, just get 1. So he came back with 1. So my husband was so sweet. He says, what if some other family who is also vegan, vegetarian, and they can't eat regular pizza? I want to leave some for them. That's a really sweet way of thinking. So in crisis, to think in a sweet way requires some belief system that helps you come on track,
Well, hearing about what your husband did with those pizzas, now that you're getting into the solutions of how families can be resilient, you're going to teach us how we can actually thrive. And I've heard you talk about the idea of that you have to thrive with grace. That's how I would define your husband's action.
That's great. And just to finish up from Walsh's 9 tracks that she mentions, a belief system is like 3 buckets I was mentioning. Belief system is 1, organization is 2nd, and communication. So yeah, I think one of the ways to come around to the other side is through having strong belief system or positive outlook or spirituality, having a belief that everybody's equal and we must look out for the welfare of the others. That's the kind of belief system that can help a crisis to come to the other side with grace. Just the second point about that was organization. So since family is a unit, a structure, that if it creates mutually supporting actions and connectedness, that seems to have an incredible impact. And how to stay connected is what we'll get into pretty quickly. And those families that have stability, yet stability, tend to do better. And it's so interesting to me, those families who have networks, not just having connectedness to some families, but community resources or networks such as their church or organizations or networks that they regularly participate in, they seem to do better. And last, the communication, which is that if communication is open, that means willingness to talk about your emotions, clear, that means not laden with this judgmental or heavy, brutal, kind of punitive conversations, then that seems to have a positive impact as well on a family's capacity to cope and bounce back. And one more characteristic about the communication style is that really having a good way to temper emotions. And when presenting opinions, they're expressed freely. So every member has equal opportunity to say what's on their mind. And they don't run into any risk of being judged as silly or stupid or how dare you say that. So there's some kind of free, like democratic communication, if I may say so. And finally, family members tend to have incredible empathy and resourcefulness within psychological resourcefulness. So to answer your question about grace, dictionary defines grace as simple elegance or refinement of movement. And more religious reference, for example, in Christianity, defines grace as the free and unlimited favor of God as manifested in the salvation of sinners and the bestowal of blessings. So what I love that unmerited favor. So whether you believe in God or not, there's no reason why I was able to come across 4 remaining pizza when every aisle was wiped clean, right? So that's grace. That means I don't know why this favor is waiting for me, but I was able to. So kind of having that recognition that grace is bestowed upon you can lead to that perspective building and developing and sharpening sense of purpose and sense of having strong belief system that governs the family. That can be really, really helpful. The other thing to think about, family characteristics of families that do survive, apparently wealth or efficiency were not the factors that seem to matter in defining or predicting who will be a resilient family unit. In fact, it was determined by three important elements. One was unity, a sense of togetherness, ways that the families were tied together. That seemed to matter. A second thing was creativity and openness with which people looked at their life's problems and say, aha, this is a problem, I can solve it. That helped. And then the deep sense of hope, those who carried that incredible sense of, I see hope for myself, I can offer hope. And hope doesn't mean removing the problem. Hope actually just means being able to manage the problem with some sort of assurance that it's going to be okay. And that seemed to really matter. So the grace in these situations is to have that perspective that it's going to all work out. It may not be the same, but it's going to work out.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to see friends of mine who, when this all started, they were all full of hope and vigor and all right, we'll ride the storm together. But then as this thing's dragged on, you're starting to see some of those tensions build up. But then there's others that you see them rising to the occasion. I mean, so I'm beginning to now look at those observations through a different lens. This person's resilient, that person isn't, or those families.
Yeah. And so that's what brings me to the concept of skills. So as we come to the end, think about the goal of us as a family, or each family unit's job or aspiration should be, how can we develop skills? And so skills of resiliency, according to Ben Silman, he says that children and adults who learn the values and skills of resiliency cope with stress, manage relationships, and contribute to others' lives more consistently than those without such strengths. So this is such a jam-packed sentence there. I feel what it's saying that it's not just having the quick wit to put the mask on yourself, but also look around and find those who need a mask but can't reach it, using the airplane analogy here. And so some of the themes that are emerging is, how can families mutually support themselves? How can they be consistent in spite of all this chaos? How can they care and express or develop communication of caring and empathy? How can they activate spirituality or larger purpose and meaning? And finally, how can they build or activate or kind of come into focus or bring into focus a sense of community consciousness? And those things seem to really, really help. So the first thing, as I was mentioning, assess our attitude, and we can say, am I an optimistic person? Am I a pessimistic person? Now, being a pessimist or realist is not so much of a bad thing. It is just that can influence your communication. A realist, in fact, can assess the accuracy of a situation far better than an optimist. But what we want to see is a balance. So again, to quote Walsh, she says, master the art of the possible. That means understand that things you can't change and then work on things that can change, that wisdom quote that we often hear. And then, in fact, in terms of skill building, we need practice. And the practice is to recreate a thinking framework. So I hate to give people an assignment, but one of the things that we need to think about, a simple modification in daily life people can make, is just kind of rein back, hang back a little bit, and instead of reacting, reflect a little bit more. Maybe you don't have all the skills at once, but at least one skill that you can develop is to say, give me a minute, let me get back to you. Or I'm in the middle of this. Do you mind if I answered that in a minute? Even saying that, I was talking to some families that I support and help. And one mother said to me that, I said, why are you not working on your own stuff and let children do their own stuff? She said, I just can't do anything. I just can't do when they are around. So it's really hard if they are around and you can't function. Then you are creating an unreasonable expectation for your family that every person should have some individual time. And maybe this is not the time where you will be gifted that. So kind of adjusting your attitude is really, really helpful.
Well, and what came to my mind hearing you just now was the classic case of, you can only do something about the things you can actually control.
Yes.
If you try to influence the entire global pandemic and all of its repercussions, you're going to go mad. So what else can folks do to get
here's
through?
Another thing. I don't know if you have done this with your wife, but I have actually tried. When my son got home, both my sons got home, we 5 of us sat down. We didn't do it in formal ways, but we wanted to kind of understand what the purpose is. What's going to be the purpose of next 2 months? Like, what do we want to accomplish? Because this is such a different moment in my life because both my children have left the nest and they have returned. And every time they have returned, they always had a return ticket. So they were so guaranteed that I'm not going to be in the claws of my parent. And we were also expecting to go back to this empty nesters lifestyle. But now one of my son's job is on hold until the city of New York opens. Another son's project in Tanzania is on hold because he can't continue to support online. So while that's the case, which has brought this situation of not knowing. So in not knowing, establish some sense of common purpose and mutualized goals. A few things that we have done is we want to have dinners and we set up days that we want to have dinners together. Since everybody is at home, we decide, are we going to eat together lunch or we're not going to eat? I think eating together is quite a bit of commitment. And I like to say that because even though I love my family, I cannot spend that much time if I have back-to-back meetings, right? So in one of the things, you remember that Carrie Underwood, I guess, the America's Got Talent or American Idol winner.
Yep.
There was a song, Jesus Take the Wheels. You remember?
Yep.
That song? So I've heard people say that, to keep my sanity, I talk to God. That helps me through my rough days. So kind of having your own mechanisms and kind of exploring those mechanisms for yourself before imposing those mechanisms. And I will suggest to parents to really hang back and not become these advisors to their children, constantly telling them what to do to cope better. Coping better doesn't improve by telling people to cope better. It's a very important lesson. And that brings me to this idea of expanded boundaries. That means really planting yourself in a new environment in a way such that you create some sense of boundaries, some sense of what are you going to carry from previous habits, previous lifestyle, and what are you going to form as a new set of habits. But creating that structure really can help.
And it also sounds to me, though, that we still have to improve our ability to communicate with each other. I mean, that's always been important, but particularly now when you're in a stressful situation, yeah?
Touche. I think the last thing I will offer people is this idea of effective communication. And, I am speech and language pathologist, a communication expert, if I may say so myself. One of the things that I have found incredibly difficult for people is to engage in assertive communication. So there are 4 types of communication. You have passive communication, not responding, just becoming silent. Second is aggressive communication, attacking. No, I didn't say that. No, I didn't do it. Oh, I thought you were going to do it. Just confrontational, in your face, oppositional, just challenging. Third communication is passive aggressive, huffing and puffing. My brothers and I very fondly remember this. My mother, when we were teenagers, would go from one room to another, murmuring to herself, I don't know what I have done to deserve these kids. I remember this so distinctly. And my brothers and I, we used to look at each other and what is going on? And so she would never say directly what we were doing wrong, but the angst she felt because we were not cooperating or not following instructions. So that's passive aggressive communication, is not really expressing, and your aggression is kind of smothered with language of love. Could you please take the dog out? Your mommy needs your help. That's very manipulative. Yep. And then the last is assertive, is to say, I am in a meeting. I hope it's okay with you that you feed the dog. But if you can't, I'm sure I can take care of it at 2:00. Now, what you're doing is you're clearly describing your situation. You're clearly defining your expectation, and you're clearly setting an end solution if the cooperation is not there. And so this is something really can help families to be effective in heightening their communication. Few things that we can do, which is now rampant, Zoom meals, like cooking together or sharing family stories, kind of taking your children for a walk and telling stories, or finding out about neighbors and telling relationship with neighbors. Just kind of expressing and externalizing your thinking is really, really helpful ways of communicating. And lastly, celebrating joys together. It's not an issue of problem solving, but it is having fun as you're solving problems and celebrating our own capacities to think and bounce back, and having a really lighthearted attitude towards mistakes. So in closing, I will say one of the most amazing ways families can maintain their sense of oneness when the amount of pressure is unsurmountable is to shift your perspective about the half glass full attitude. Have a way to review adversity in a positive light rather than getting run down by obstacles. Find ways to be transformed and instill a sense of hope and optimism that this will change. But just like happiness, as I mentioned, bad situations also don't stay forever. And that's my message for everybody. And I'm wishing everybody the best to find means and resources within and tapping into the world that is there for us, creating and expanding our social capital so we can be a resilient family together.
On behalf of all of us, I'm grateful to your help and guidance as we all try to become more resilient families. So thank you for all of that information. All right, that's all the time we have for today. If you know of someone who might benefit from listening to today's conversation, we would be most grateful if you would kindly forward it directly to them, perhaps some of your friends who are having some tricky family situations at this time. All right, so on behalf of our host, Sucheta Kamath, and all of us at EXQ, thanks for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again right here next week on Full Prefrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive functions. To contact our host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive functions, visit her website at cerebralmatters.com. That's cerebralmatters.com. Tune in next week for the next informative episode of Full Prefrontal.